to show the New York Times fascinating documentary on Christine Quinn and have a panel discussion with some folks from the campaign and some production folks. And tonight's forum is going to be moderated by Rick Berke. Rick is no stranger to the forum. He's been a panelist and a moderator on several occasions. He was a 1997 IOP fellow. He's currently a member of our senior advisory committee, and his title currently at the New York Times is Senior Editor and Director of Video Content. So he's the video guy for the New York Times website. So if you've seen their amazing videos, his job is to try to get more of those out there and produced and viewed. So please join me in welcoming Rick, who's going to moderate tonight's forum. Rick.
Thank you, Trey. Can you hear me? Is this on? Thank you, Trey. Thanks, everyone, for coming. This, I think, is going to be a great event, and what's going to make it great is it's not just us boring journalists, but we have two people from the campaign who we have not spoken to except for hello just 5 minutes ago since this documentary came out. So how often do you get to see their reaction to our documentary? So first I just want to especially thank Josh Isay, the chief strategist for the Quinn campaign, and Mike Morey for their participation tonight and throughout the documentary. So they're really good sports all along and to be here tonight. So thank you.
Thanks.
Can we have some applause for them? And on my left from the New York Times video team, we have Nancy Donaldson, who is the supervising producer of this documentary. We have Zena Barakat, who is a video journalist whose idea was to do this in the first place early in the year. And we have Brent McDonald, the lead video journalist on the project. We also have a whole crew of other people who worked night and day to make this documentary happen, who we couldn't fit on stage. But this, I think, will give you a good representation of the people involved. And I just want to say our goal, and I hope the end result of this documentary was, to me, it has a universal appeal. You don't have to live in New York. You don't have to know who Christine Quinn is. But to me, it really shows sort of an inside, authentic look of what it's like to run for political office today, especially if you live in New York, especially if you add the layer if you're a woman, especially if you're openly gay, all these extra things that Christine Quinn had to deal with. And I think the other thing that I think this documentary accomplished, or at least it was our goal, was to show the relationship between a candidate and her spouse. Because you often don't see that kind of relationship up close, straight or gay. It's a unique thing, and it's something you wouldn't know from reading our daily coverage or anyone's daily coverage. It was something new and different about this documentary. So those were two of our goals that we hoped we accomplished. Why don't I start with Zena, and this is something that we normally don't do at the New York Times, half-hour documentaries tied to the news where we had special access. Why did you think this was a good idea to start with?
Well, I didn't know what it was going to turn out to be, but I knew that, what we can do best at the Times is do these sort of longer form things that we hadn't done a 30-minute doc per se. We had done some maybe 20-minute things, but I just knew that we could kind of have a totally different look at the mayoral race by taking a step back and sort of observing it unfold and showing it after the fact. That was something that there are lots of news organizations in New York, New York One, NBC, CBS, there are all these news organizations that are doing it day by day, minute by minute, and so we had an opportunity to kind of have that up-close New York look, but from a different viewpoint.
And this all started in last March with Zena and I and Carolyn Ryan, the political editor, and Josh and Christine Quinn and I all had lunch to discuss doing this project. Josh, why did you all decide to go along with it?
You're very persuasive.
But he did put us off for several months.
Well,
so why did you put us off, and then why did you decide to do it?
Well, I'm not sure we put you off. I think we had initial discussions, and I think both sides, those kind of discussions fell off for a little while. We were busy in a campaign. You guys were busy running a newspaper and doing great videos. So I think time got in the way. Anthony Weiner got in the race, and I think that changed the focus for you guys, I think, and for us, so we became less center stage. And I think the discussion started again, or you guys contacted us again in earnest right about the time Anthony had the, everyone's familiar with what happened in that race, perhaps, or I could talk about it, at least give you the G-rated version. Anthony Weiner got in the race, kind of surged into a tie for first, and then it came out that some other, he had been doing some other chatting under the alias of Carlos Danger, cannot make this stuff up. And then he went from kind of mid-20s in the polls all the way down, and bottom fell out. And then I think the conversation started again with you guys.
Mike, what was your biggest fear about doing this project?
Yeah, so I actually, it took a lot of convincing for me. My biggest fear was, on the one hand, there was a lot of management that had to happen internally while we're running a campaign in a tough race with multiple opponents. So it required a great deal of focus to ensure that you could get the access you wanted. And frankly, it was an unvarnished inside look, and mistakes happen in campaigns. And so those mistakes could very well have become part of the documentary. Sometimes mistakes show the humanity of an individual. Sometimes mistakes show flubs. We say things sometimes that we regret we said, and so there was always that, in my mind, there was a fear that you might get a look at something that if you were there in the moment might understand it, but if you're not there in the moment and someone else were to look at it 5 months later, could be problematic in the long term. So it took a little convincing.
Nancy, what was your biggest fear on your end going into this project?
I think my biggest fear was access, and just, are we going to be able to, if we're going to devote this amount of resources. So the New York Times usually doesn't put 6 people on a project. It's usually 1 or 2. And so to do something of this scale required a very large commitment of resources from some of our best video journalists in the building. And I think my biggest fear was that we're going to spend so much time doing this and all we're going to get is the stuff that everyone else is getting. And the only reason to do it is to show something that people haven't seen.
And I would, look, I want to be honest, my biggest fear, because by the time we agreed to this, it was clear that it was a very tough fight. We could win, we could lose, but it was a very tough fight. My biggest fear, and we talked about this, was that we would lose, and that Chris, who is a dear friend of mine and a wonderful person, was going to look kind of bad in the loss, and that it would be something that would stick with her over time, which would not have been fair to her, would not have been the right thing to do. She did lose, but I think the documentary, to everyone's credit, is something that shows kind of her humanity and is actually, I think, a accurate and moving portrait of what it does mean to run in New York City and how unbelievably tough this is in a way that no story in print can capture, and I don't think a lot of movies have captured or documentaries have captured.
Brent, how did you prepare to live and breathe Christine Quinn for several weeks, day after day, night after night?
I told my wife I probably won't be home much first, but also I guess when thinking about, what sold me on the project and what got me excited about it and willing to invest so much time, sort of day after day, week after week, covering the campaign was the access, and while at the same time knowing that access can be overrated, but the opportunity to sort of get close to a candidate, to slip into their skin, feel what it's like to be them on the campaign trail, but knowing that just being closer to a candidate physically doesn't necessarily bring you closer to the truth of what they're experiencing. So that was a challenge to me about, okay, what will we really be able to capture with the access that we've been given? And
And let me just say to everyone, as much as we tried to convince them to do this, there was some concern on our end about whether we should do this at the New York Times, because it's something we had an agreement with the campaign to get special access that our political reporters day-to-day weren't getting. So we were privy to certain information, so we kind of walled off what we were doing with what they were doing. And there was a concern, like you might think that it would have been terrific video if we had seen a meltdown by Christine Quinn on video. But what if we had seen that and it was really disturbing and she won the primary and we withheld that from our audience and then she won the general election? We could be accused of, why did you withhold that? Voters should have known that. So we were up against that happening. We were up against, why did you decide to put all these resources on her when, and the New York Times later endorsed her? Was it all part of a cabal, even though the endorsement is a whole separate, non-editorial thing? There are a lot of internal concerns that we had to overcome as well. And in the end, you kind of just cross your fingers and hope it's going to all work out. And there has to be a trust level. I mean, the press and politicians are sort of natural adversaries, but there has to be a certain trust and respect for us to do this. They have to trust us that we are not going to take what we have and twist it in a way that's unfair. And we have to trust them enough to know that they will let us into enough events so it's not a staged, not a whole stage thing. So there was this sort of tug going on, but I think we both, I have to say, I think on both ends we lived up to the deal. Why don't you set up the first clip that we'd like to show, and that's about term limits.
Right, so Christine Quinn, as many of you know, has been the speaker of the New York City Council, and I think a lot of what we observed was that she was running on her record as speaker. But following her on the trail, we began to observe that people also had a real issue with a number of the decisions she made as speaker, and one of those was the decision playing sort of a key role in extending term limits and allowing Michael Bloomberg to run for a third term as well as the other city council members. So the clip that you're about to see is on the trail with her as she's out leafleting and having an interaction with someone spontaneously, and then me circling back with her in the car afterwards about how they went down.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I could never vote for you after what you did on term limits.
Okay, well, I'm sorry about that.
It was unforgivable.
Okay. Thank you for stopping.
Mayor, next Tuesday, say hi to Chris.
Mike Bloomberg is an asset in a general election, but a liability in a Democratic primary. I think somewhere along the way she had to define herself. Was she a challenger or a continuation of Bloomberg?
Why do you think people are so polarized over the term limits issue? Why it's important to them now?
I'm not 100% sure because, that it's still something so many people are so passionate about. I don't really know. I mean, I understand certainly why people are angry about it. The depth of the anger still sometimes surprises me, but I certainly understand that. I don't minimize what we did by any stretch of the imagination.
Josh and Mike, what did you think of that segment? What's your reaction to
that? I mean, it was something that clearly we heard about on the campaign trail. It does not surprise me that you saw that interaction. It was obviously something that as a campaign we were prepared for as a negative against her. And it was one that, in a lot of ways, preordained our relationship with the incumbent in terms of our positioning with him, not only the fact that she had been his legislative partner for 8 years. He was mayor, she was speaker, and they did a lot of things together. A lot of the kind of discussion during the campaign was, and even in the year before, should she distance herself from him? Should she get close to him? What's the dynamic there? And the vote to allow voters a chance to vote for him for a third term, and the council in some ways preordained that relationship, because it meant that you couldn't really run away from him, because in fact you had given voters the opportunity to give him another term.
Mike?
Yeah, well, we knew for a lot of people in this race that decision and that decision alone would have the final impact on the way they would cast their ballot. At the same time, we had part of what was unique about Christine Quinn. What is unique about Christine Quinn is that she is not someone who runs away from a decision that she makes. She is someone who, on every decision, in fact, most decisions, she's sort of steadfast and she will accept the consequences for a decision. We knew there would be consequences for that decision. And what we tried to do, and what she did on the campaign trail, was say, I understand that this is a problem for you. I would urge you to look at, in the course of my career, a host of issues that I've worked on, and I'd ask you to look at my record in its totality. But we were not, it's just not part of who Christine Quinn is. It's a decision she stood by. It's a decision she was willing to say to the voters, look, it was a tough decision, I made it. I accept the consequences for that. And frankly, we oftentimes message that in juxtaposition to some of our opponents in the race who were less likely to be as steadfast in position. So we knew it was going to be something that came up a lot, and it did.
Brent, what did it take for you to get that scene?
Well, that was one of probably a few different scenes where that issue came up. People walked up to her to address her on the term limits. And I mean, in that particular, and sometimes I was up close, sort of observing within a few feet. And this time I had a long lens and I was sort of at a distance, zooming in, just following her face fairly closely cropped in, as you can tell. But I mean, just logistically, it didn't take all that much. Just sort of being there and observing and staying out of the way. And I can't tell necessarily that she responded differently in that scenario than she would have were I not there. I didn't ever feel like that affected at all how she responded to those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Nancy, could you talk about Anybody But Quinn and why we thought that was important to get it in this document, to get them in this documentary? And then we'll show the clip.
Yeah, Anybody But Quinn was obviously an important sort of force against her, and they had captured a lot of different scenes of people campaigning against like anyone but Christine Quinn, and so it was a pretty powerful force. And I think it was something that we felt was important to include. It's obviously kind of hard to explain who these people are and sort of the magnitude of their force, but we tried to do it in this scene that we're going to show.
Can we show?
Pardon?
Yes, of course.
Did you know Quinn has blocked every animal protection bill in the city councils?
Has she?
She blocked a bill that would mandate sprinklers in pet stores. Hundreds of dogs and cats have burned to death in pet store fires.
Well, that sounds awful.
The animal rights movement has focused on the horse carriage industry. And there's nothing in New York like a small, well-organized group to make themselves heard.
Good morning, Anybody But Quinn.
Yeah. For the record, hundreds of dogs and cats have not
died
burned to death in fires in New York City pet stores, just to be clear.
Now, can you two tell us how nervous, when this came out, you lose the election, this comes out, like, was it hard to watch this or to decide to watch it?
The video.
This actual.
Well, I did.
Did you have someone like your wife watch it first?
No, my wife has not. My wife has not watched it. I I sat down, I took all the shoelaces off of my shoes, took my belt off, put it in the other room, and then watched it. I mean, yeah, it was one of my, yes, it was, there was 2 weeks between the end of the election and the movie came out. And I would call Mike every day and say, have you heard from Rick? What's the movie? When is it coming out? How bad is it going to be? Yeah, it was very nerve-wracking because, you know, we didn't want Chris, as we said before, we didn't want Chris to look bad. We didn't want to, you know, you guys could take the interviews you did with us and make us look like total jerks. And so we were concerned about kind of what the post, this was going to in some ways define the post, could have defined the post-mortem. And, you know, as I said before, instead, to your credit, what I think it did was give an insight into what it means to run in a place like New York. If I can address the anybody but Quinn campaign for one moment, is it okay if I talk about what that was about?
Sure.
Why that was? So there was a bill before the city council to ban horse carriages. So, you know, like when you go into Central Park and you do the carriage with the horse. There was a bill to ban the horse carriages, which Chris refused to pass because it was 300 jobs for the people who do the, you know, the people who run, the drivers. And these horses, I guess at one point, a long time ago, were not treated well. I mean, I don't really know, but right now, it's like the most regulated industry in New York City. The horses get more vacation than the French.
5 weeks.
Like literally, more vacation time, it's unbelievable. They're treated fine, and she highly regulated it, but there is a group of animal rights activists who really hated this. It made them extraordinarily angry, and then they launched this Anybody But Quinn campaign, funded by, I mean, this is actually great kind of political, funded by a gentleman who started something called Manhattan Storage, right? Manhattan Storage, which it's like, you know, one of these storage places. He owns garages, and so he's a garage owner, and he owns Manhattan Storage. He wanted the places that the horses are kept, the stables in the city, he wanted those sold so that he could buy them for his garages and make money as kind of increasing his garage. So he decided to spend $1 million beating Chris so that she wouldn't be mayor, and the current mayor, the Democratic nominee for mayor, who will be mayor, has said, Bill de Blasio said that during the course of the campaign, he promised on day one, he would outlaw these horse-drawn carriages during the campaign. On day one, he would, which when you think about what you're going to do on day one, find the bathroom, you know, that might not be on the top. Yeah.
Mike, on a different note, you were just, what was it like for you to see this for the first time?
It was hard. It was very difficult to see it, and it was difficult for a good reason. I think that I was a student of politics before I was a practitioner of politics. So I was a political science professor for a couple of years, and one of the things that, I primarily taught campaigns and elections and institutions, and one of the things that sort of we look at politics and we see these politicians, and we see sort of this sport occurring. You've got, you know, Team A and Team B, and they have debates and they go at each other. They're up in the polls, they're down in the polls. Their allies come in, people spend money, there's ads all over. And we often forget that these people put their pants on the same way you and I do every morning. These people have relationships, these people have emotions, these people can be sensitive, these people can be tough. And unless you are with these individuals and you see that yourself, you would never know it, primarily because of the way in which we cover politics. And so what was somewhat heartbreaking to watch, while at the same time so encouraging to see documented, was the humanity of the individuals who were involved in this process. And that, you know, it's very easy for us to go online and write some anonymous blog post and say some very inappropriate things. It's very easy for us to make a campaign contribution to an independent expenditure group for hundreds of dollars and then launch attacks on an individual, and we just assume that there's sort of this sort of other that don't feel emotion the same way that you and I do, or don't have the same kind of relationships that you and I do. And the documentary did a phenomenal job of actually demonstrating to folks who don't see what happens behind closed doors that these are people, and that it's a tough business and you need to be tough to be in it, but I don't care how tough you are, you can't take those kinds of lobs, man, woman, or child, and not have let it affect you after a while. And if it does anything, my hope is that we recognize and appreciate that while we give public officials and politicians sort of we paint them with this sort of brush of self-serving interest and sort of, in it for themselves, that what this actually might show is that these people are human beings who do feel it the same way you and I do. And I think it did a phenomenal job.
Now, you were in the documentary several times in interviews. What was the reaction to your friends and family to how you came off?
That I looked really tired.
I didn't want to say, but you look great right now.
I was tired. I was very tired. There was actually, so your friends and family watch it with a very different lens because they're looking at the person they haven't seen in months, and they're seeing, so they sort of know what I do, but don't really appreciate it so much. They sort of have this West Wing idea of what we do. And what the response I got primarily was that it was really honest. You were honest about both your opponent. When your opponent deserved credit, you gave credit. You were honest about some of the difficulties in running a race with the female candidate and with the gay candidate. And so it was sort of the appreciation for, and frankly because of the arrangement we had in doing it, knowing that it wouldn't be out until after the election were over, it sort of does free you up to a degree to be honest. And so that's primarily what I heard.
Let's show a clip now where we talk about political ads, and both Mike and Josh, I think, are in this clip.
In the course of the last 5-6 weeks, I've had to beat back stories about the shoes Chris Quinn wears, how much she pays to have her hair done, why she wore pink to a debate, why her laugh is so loud. I don't see those stories, and I certainly know that those things don't get asked of some of our opponents in this race.
As mayor, I'll build on our progress, and I'll make sure that nobody gets left behind. Is that too happy? Yeah.
Chris's gender as the only woman in the race, it's been a challenge. It has been a challenge.
And I'll make sure that nobody gets left behind.
One more, guys. Back to one.
Keep your eye, try to keep the eyes open.
I don't want the opposite direction.
We have to recognize that and calibrate that to a certain degree or be mindful of it. It's much harder to lead with tough when you're a woman candidate than it is if you're a male candidate.
Everybody, we're going to stop, all right? Everybody come down the slide, everybody come down to the bottom over here. And when we're ready, we're going to do what I told you, all right? We're going to start over there. Are we almost ready?
Zena, can you talk about how we dealt with her being a woman in this documentary and the sensitivities involved?
It was something that people talked about a lot in terms of, the coverage and all these things, but I actually went through and I was trying to find exact examples of this. Like, people are, saying these things about her because she's a woman or because she's gay, and it's so much more subtle than that. And it's so interesting. It's like an undercurrent, and it's like really hard to find exact examples, but it's there. And one thing that I wanted to make sure as we were working on this and watching different cuts was that these issues were kind of separated, that we kind of showed her as a woman, as a candidate, as a gay woman, as a woman in a relationship, that her being in a relationship with a woman wasn't defined by her sexuality. It was defined by her having a relationship with her spouse. And so it was kind of humanizing her in these ways and not just making it that she's a gay candidate, therefore her relationship with her spouse is somehow different. So I thought that was shown in this. It was a very interesting aspect of the documentary. I just thought it humanized her in a way, and you got to see her in a way. And that was something that, we had talked about early on, how much Kim, her spouse, would be in the documentary, and how much she would be in the campaign. I think you guys can talk about that, but she turned out to be such an interesting voice. She could speak about, Speaker Quinn in such a way that was so interesting and natural, because she didn't have the political speak. So she was a huge asset for us for understanding her better.
And that's something that we had no expectation of going in, because at that original lunch in March, both Christine, Quinn, and Josh said, you're probably not going to get her to talk at all. She's really shy. You'll be lucky if you get one interview with her. So, and she ended up being a big theme of this whole thing. Nancy, could you talk a little? There were times when this was finally being edited toward the end, when I know we were all saying, this is either too nice or too tough. I mean, and we were trying to get it just right. Talk about that.
I think, the bar is set pretty high for creating political documentaries, and I think that plays into both the accuracy of how you present the person, but also sort of the style in which we edit. So there was a lot of talk about, are we spending too much time on this issue and not enough on that? Are we, going about this the right way? And I think at the end of the day, it was trying to find a way to tell this story in a more experiential format, where you could just sort of be along the ride rather than having, heavy narration and analysis on the piece. And so I think what it took to do that was finding these moments that balance each other and showing it to a lot of the, colleagues of ours who weren't intimately involved in the process, to say, how does this come off? Because once you get so invested with content like this, it does become hard over time to be objective and to really separate yourself from what's in there and what's not in there, and what you know and what you have put in, and all of that stuff. So I think it was like a constant calibration of, are we going too far this way, then we pull it back. And if we pull it back too far, then we try to meet in the middle. And I really do think it was up until the last draft that we really hit the mark.
Let's show another clip of, to me, this is one of the most memorable, searing scenes. And then we'll have Brent talk about it after it's over. This is number 4. And this is primary day coming out of her apartment in Chelsea.
Hi, how are you? Thank you very much. Thank you. Right or left, right?
Oh, have a nice day.
Watch out for
What were they
the
yelling?
I don't know. It's hard to tell sometimes.
Brent?
So one of the things about covering Christine Quinn's campaign is that, as opposed to some of the other candidates, her schedule didn't come out until the morning of, or the events were embargoed until the time of the event. I got the schedule typically the night before, sometimes not until midnight or so, but it was always, you have to be very fleet of foot. But one of the reasons, and they can explain better than I can, that her itinerary was embargoed was because people like these would show up to a lot of the events, what she would call the antes. And so this was sort of the first time I'd been able to observe. I arrived at her apartment on primary morning, like 6 o'clock, and we walked out. I didn't know they were going to be there, but they'd gotten a heads up, and I was told, we're going to take off without you, more or less. That was the message I was given, so don't delay. But just walking out and following her and then seeing that and capturing her reaction, you get a sense like she has dealt with this a lot. So,
Do you all have it? What was your reaction to that scene?
It's probably one of the harder scenes to watch for the reasons I mentioned before. The frustrating thing, so we did keep the schedule embargoed, and we kept it embargoed until the point in time of the actual event. There had been a few instances in the course of the campaign in which, when that embargo was broken, not only did protesters show up, but at one point it became physical. A state senator had been slapped, an intern had been slapped, and so this isn't just, in some cases, some of the protest is more agitation than protest. And so we were very careful of that for that reason. And they can be quite disruptive, as you've seen. Can you imagine on the day of your election, the day you've been working for a year? That's the moment you need to get in that zone and be in that place in your headspace where, today's the last day, we've got to turn out our votes. I need to feel good, I want to be in a positive place, and you step out of your door, and that happens. So it was quite frustrating, and it certainly had an impact, and it did require some strategic decision-making with respect to our schedule. Sometimes they were successful, and whether that was relationships they had from people who got our schedule, and maybe they were able to get it. Every now and then, though, they were able to get a hold of the schedule, and there's an example of what would you say, but it strikes me, it bothers me a little bit, this episode in particular, because it was the day of the election, and it was indicative of...
It bothers you that people did that, or it bothers you that
it bothers me for her to have experienced that when she walked out of her apartment.
But are you glad that it's documented?
I am. No, I'm very glad it's documented. I'm very glad, because I think, again, it goes to what I think overall this documentary has done, which is demonstrate that, whether we like these people or not, whether we like their policies or not, whether they're on, they're a D or an R or everything in between, they're all people. And so I think that this shows you some of, particularly in moments like this, in moments where you would just like to be able to step out your front door on the most important day of the last year and just get to work.
Quick question for Nancy. Would this have been a better or worse documentary if she had won?
Better.
Much better.
I think it's a really good question. I mean, obviously, when we started this, she was the clear front runner. So we didn't really have a contingency plan for this to go the way it did until a couple weeks before the primary, where the polls started to slip. And I think this was one of those situations where we knew there was a lot of potential in this story, but it really was a searcher. Brent was with them night and day. We had a couple other shooters rounding out the rest of the coverage, and we were really looking for what story are we trying to tell? We didn't know that until close to the primary. And so, it's hard to say, because I think we were on a path of discovery, and had she made it through the runoff and onwards, it obviously would be a very different story. So it's hard to say.
Please line up if you have any questions. And while you're lining up, I'm going to ask an audience participation question, and that is, and I'll tell you in advance what my question is going to be. For those of you who have seen the whole thing, I'm going to ask you to pretend that the two campaign strategists aren't in the room and say, do you like Christine Quinn more because of this documentary or less? So if you like her more and you feel more that she's more appealing because of this documentary, raise your hand. Okay, and if you like her, if you've seen her flaws and her up close and like her less, raise your hand. One? Anyone else? No. That's interesting. Okay, please identify yourselves when you ask a question. Just let's one tight, brief question per person, and do not end your question, or questions end with a question mark, right? That's what I'm supposed to say. All right.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Amna, a sophomore at the college, and I'm a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee. After watching the documentary, is there anything that you noticed that you wish you could have changed about the campaign, specifically regarding the stop and frisk issue that DeBroja brought up?
No, because I don't think look, obviously when you lose, you look back and you say there are things you wish you could have done differently and would have done differently. In the documentary itself, I don't think that was kind of the point of the documentary. In other words, it was not like a tactical look at the campaign. So I don't look back and say there were things we wish we could have done differently. On Stop and Frisk, she believes that we should have mended the tactic, changed the tactic, reformed the tactic, and she took measures to do that as Speaker.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Alec Barrett. I'm from New York and currently a master's student at the School of Education. For those of you at the Times, I'm wondering, the fact that she lost, how will that shape your likelihood of taking on a project like this in the future? And for those of you on the campaign, the fact that she lost, how will this affect her public future, whatever that may be?
Who wants to grab?
Sure, I'll take that. I don't think it would change the likelihood of whether I would take on a project like this at all, actually. I mean, we understood pretty well, even though she was leading at the polls, that there was a good chance that we thought even if she didn't win, she would still be in the runoff. We didn't ever expect it to be, the loss to be that dramatic. But, I mean, this is a contest. There are winners and losers, and so there's always going to be a clear ending to the story when you follow a campaign. And, the trick is just figuring out what is the meat of the story between the beginning and the ending.
Mike, does this help or hurt her chances of a resurrection?
Well, look, Christine Quinn is fairly young. She's not 50 years old yet, which, I mean, most members of Congress don't get elected until they're in their 60s, and some of them serve until their 90s. So did this do damage to her if she should choose at some point to serve in public office again? I don't think so. I think that I think it showed a side of her that was often not portrayed, not for lack of authenticity, but so much so because it's sort of folks pay attention to a horse race and not necessarily an individual for the individual they are.
In purely political terms, is it a net plus for her? As a political strategist?
It's not a negative. I don't know if I could say it's a net
so
plus.
So in reporter's terms, that's a plus.
You could have neutral.
It's funny, when we screened this for our chief political reporter, and we were all saying, oh, poor Christine Quinn, it's going to show her, really up close and personal, losing a campaign. His first reaction is, this is the best thing to happen to her, because it shows a just as the audience showed. I'm not weighing in one way or the other, but as you all said, you all like her better, those of you who've seen it. So we'll see, check back in 10 years, we'll see what happens. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Carolina, and I'm a freshman at the college. My question is more directly towards the strategy and campaign part. Do you think the outcome of the election would have been different if you would have capitalized on the identity side of politics and the fact that, and on the historic side, the fact that she was the first female and openly gay, she would have been the first female and openly gay mayor of New York City?
I mean, look, we talked about that obviously a lot in the campaign, and we talked, internally about how to talk about being the first woman, first gay, potentially first gay mayor. People don't vote for a candidate because they are a woman, or let me put it this way. Most people do not vote for a candidate because they're a woman or because they are gay. It can certainly be a factor in it, but it is not the determinative factor. And we did, and any time you do a campaign, you do focus groups and you do polling and you talk to other people who have been in similar situations. And that was not a path to victory, was to make this about a first. It can be part of the calculus, but it's not going to be the overwhelming reason to vote for someone. And I think if you talk to folks at Emily's List or anyone on the Clinton campaign from, when she ran for president, they'll tell you that it can be an element of it, but it can't be the reason for it.
And I would just add to that, too, that since the election, it's amazing sometimes to read on the one hand, you get criticized for you can't build an entire candidacy around identity. So like that's where you made your mistake. On the other hand, you didn't play up your identity enough. So, I mean, if you read, I've read enough about the lack of trying to use identity, and I've read enough saying that she ran a campaign on the fact that she would be the first woman. And so, as Josh said, the data don't bear out that is a winning strategy. But we've heard it from both sides that we either did it too much or we didn't do it enough. Our objective was always to make the case that in terms of the field that was put in front of the voters, that this woman, who is also gay, is the best candidate for the job because of X, Y, and Z.
And one of the interesting kind of things I think to look at after this campaign, after the Hillary campaign, and after other similar campaigns is, how does a woman run for high-profile executive office? You add the being a gay woman in there as well is another layer to it. But kind of looking at that, and as Zena said, it's not so much that the coverage is different, although there is difference in the coverage. It's how do people interpret the coverage is kind of a fascinating sociological study, and one that I think we need to do if we really want to have women in high power executive positions. Is something that folks really have to take a look at.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Meg. I'm a sophomore here at the college. So we're living a time with historic representation of women in government. I was reading a study published this year, I believe out of American University, that showed there's a huge gender gap amongst college-age students in terms of political ambition. Men were twice as likely to be considering a run for elected office, and over 60% of women said that they would never, under any circumstances, consider a run for office. And so having followed Christine Quinn in her campaign, I was wondering if you guys have an insight into why women would be specifically disenfranchised or disenchanted with the political process or politics? Or
Professor Morey?
So there's the two things. One, there's the notion of the pipeline for women in politics. There simply aren't enough who are in positions for young women to see. And also the pipeline, of which some people argue that it's a numbers game. The fact is, in the contested elections in this country, there just aren't enough women in the races to be competitive, and so therefore, naturally, you have less women who achieve elected office. I would say to you that in terms of the impact, sort of watching these types of races and the impact it has on women. Look, one of the things I'll be a little frank about this. I don't necessarily think that the media is making a conscientious effort to report on women candidates in a different way. But when women politicians exhibit the same attributes as male politicians, there is a different reception of that in the public. I would say to you that when I think of sort of tough, effective, compromising, gets things done, I hear things like LBJ, and they write volumes about the master of the Senate. When I hear about really folks who work together with a Republican president of the United States to get massive reforms to Social Security and public education, I hear names like Tip O'Neill. Yet it is a very different dynamic on the receiving end. Again, it's not necessarily the reporting end, but on the receiving end, there is a different sort of sociological thing going on in which the reception of a woman being as transactional, effective, tough, compromising, is received a little different, I think. And so, how does that play out to young women? If you see a woman doing the same sort of exercising the same attributes as a male politician, and somehow the reception of that is different by nature, one would say, well, wait a minute. So I think it certainly plays out.
I also think that, look, I think the reason young women may say, I don't want to enter into public office. I think there have been a lot of studies about even women in a classroom. You probably see this in your classes when men are raising their hands and trying to answer every question, and women are sitting back and not doing that. I think there's a whole bunch of reasons societally that women are not doing that. In fact, I had this kind of this moment. I have a 5-year-old daughter. And at one point in the middle of the campaign, we're in the car, and she said, can a woman even be mayor? And it was kind of this awful moment of,
Wow.
yeah, of course a woman can be mayor. We're trying to get one to be mayor. But it was not even, it's not even in her consciousness. And I hopefully that will change.
Let's quickly get through the remaining 5 questions. Yep.
Sure. Hi, my name is Will. I'm a student at the college, and one of the best moments I thought in the documentary is that scene sort of at the end after she sort of found out she's lost, and she's in that she's in an embrace with her wife, and Josh trying to block the camera, and so I was wondering, because I've been around a lot of campaign people, and there's sort of a pathological distrust of the media, and how you and the Times people sort of built that relationship to the point where they could be in that room during that moment and throughout.
Will, before you answer that, Will, thank you for setting up our final clip. It's perfect. I didn't even tell you to do that. Can we show that?
And it was all pointing in the direction of Christine Quinn as the nominee. And then things just started to go wrong. Some of them, you maybe could have predicted, but much of it you could not have predicted.
This is a loss, and it's disappointing. Less for me personally, but for what this could have meant for a lot of people, and a lot of people who worked very, very hard. And so certainly one of the things I'm going to do in the days and weeks ahead is spend time thanking people who worked really, really hard, and believed in something. And I want them to know how grateful I am.
And who will you be thinking of when you speak tonight?
I'm just not going to answer that question.
All right, thanks. All right, hey, Brent, can you give us a few minutes? Is that all right? Thanks.
Okay, Brent, what were you trying to do there, and how did you get that access? And then, Josh, what were you trying to do to stop Brent?
Well, I think in the terms of our agreement for access at the beginning was an hour in a hotel room the night of the election as the results were coming in, and an interview. But the results were coming in very fast there at the end, and what I was trying to do during this clip is actually put my microphone in my pocket while also just keeping the camera going, and while also not just being in her face or too intrusive, while still capturing the scene. And what was the rest of the question?
Why don't we go to Josh? The rest of it was Josh trying to get you out of the room.
Well, not a fun moment in the campaign, sitting in that room. We've, when you do this long enough, you are in that room when it's really happy, and you're in that room sometimes when it's really unhappy. That was obviously the latter. We had an agreement with the Times that you would have access on that night, and Chris felt, and I think the campaign felt, that when you make an agreement, you live by that agreement, and that we tried to do that. And obviously that was a moment when Chris was asked who she would be thinking about. And I think the answer probably was her mother, who had died when she was 16 years old, and I think that's certainly what was on her mind. So she broke down there, and she went to hug Kim, and I thought they had gotten the moment and deserved a little bit of privacy right there, and stepped in front of the camera.
And credit to you for honoring that agreement and letting us in the room, because I know that wasn't easy, and it was a tough atmosphere in that room. So.
Winning is better than losing. Just for the record, if you want to.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Sylvia. I'm a junior at the college. Thank you for being here tonight. My question is, we focused a lot during the forum on the humanity aspect of campaigns, and given the current discourse in DC, I wanted to know your perspective of whether or not you think that local politics are a little bit more vicious than federal politics? Because I know there's a lot of talk in the media about how much both sides hate each other, but it seems that in local politics it's a lot more personal than it is on the federal level. So I don't know if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Go ahead. You know, I think I've done a lot of federal races as well. Yes, I think in a lot of ways local races are more personal than federal races. A couple things. One, especially, there are a couple of offices that in my experience are unbelievably, I want to take a step back. The one federal office where that's not true is president. Those are very personal races, in part because mayor of New York City and president of the United States are the two offices, and I've worked on a lot of mayor's races and governor's races. These are the two offices that it's the most personal that there is, in part because people in New York, I mean, there's so much press attention. There's so much glare. It becomes it's nationalized, but it's so covered in the local races, just like a presidential races, and it just becomes personalized. Senate races, congressional races, they're about issues that in some ways are disconnected from people's lives. You know, a fight over this federal policy or that federal policy, or that it just doesn't it doesn't really get as personal. Now, having said that, I've worked on a lot of races where it comes down to very personal insults and back and forth. Someone makes a mistake and you exploit that mistake, and in federal races as well. But there's nothing quite as personal as a mayor's race in New York City, except, I think, a presidential race, which is deeply personal, obviously.
Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you. My name is Gabe Hakeem. I'm a Master's of Public Administration student here at the Kennedy School. I really enjoyed the documentary, and I think one of the things I found interesting from you two is that you said the part that you enjoyed the most was seeing your candidate being portrayed humanely, and the hardest parts to watch were when people were treating her in an inhumane way. And I felt similarly in watching the documentary myself. On the flip side, it seems like strategy around campaigns these days has almost become entirely centered around creating the opposite candidate as being some inhumane object. And I wonder how much you as strategists and the politicians themselves view themselves as being responsible for the messages that they either explicitly or implicitly approve that are not attacks on other people's policies but are more attempts to dehumanize.
So I think to some degree, if I ever go back and finish my dissertation, I'm going to change topics and talk about the celebritization of politics. And so I think that in some degrees, based on our media culture of sort of wanting sort of reality all the time, that there has been a shift in focus, and so there of sort of personal foibles, mistakes, sort of slips of the tongue, very sort of easy things that you can immediately latch onto and tear down. Let me speak to it from the campaign we worked on. Oddly enough, and call this a mistake if you want, but oddly enough, we did not spend a whole lot of time internally trying to change who this woman was. We didn't spend a whole host of time worrying about do we need to, there was a big debate. She wore pink to a debate, and so there was some question of like, was that a calculated decision that she would wear pink to soften herself against her opponents? I didn't think twice about what she wore. I mean, maybe that was a mistake, but it wasn't something that we sort of focused on as much as I think a lot of folks think we do. But I do think to some degree there has been, because of the desire to sort of scandal, the desire of celebrity, the desire of sort of reality, that there is a focus now in campaigns and politics, just like there is in sort of the regular celebrity culture, to pull out these sort of moments that are not indicative of anything other than a slip of the tongue or some silly little thing you did in college or some argument you might have had that you and I would have had anyway with anybody else. But since we're running for office, it gets heightened and people latch on to it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I want to add one other thing. I'm not sure this is an answer to your question exactly, but there was some debate, and this kind of goes back to some of the earlier questions about softening her, like, were we trying to soften her image? And again, I don't know if that goes to your question exactly, but there was an article in the New York Times, actually, in March of this year, which talked about her temper. We kind of talked about her temperament. And the fact that she would yell, had a tendency to yell sometimes, which she does. And kind of what the impact on the campaign was of that story, which was quite dramatic, actually. And it goes to the story, it kind of goes to the issue of how are women interpreted, how are women seen differently than men. A man who has a temper is seen sometimes as a leader, or a woman who has a temper can be seen as the B word. Then there was another story that came out later about her having struggles with bulimia and alcoholism. And we came out with that story, and we put that story out in part because for the year before she ran, she was panicked that someone would have seen her in a meeting, an AA meeting in the village, someone who didn't like her, and anybody but a Quinn person would come out and say, which I guarantee you would have happened in August, 2 weeks before the election. So we said, well, we're going to get that story out, nothing to be ashamed of, and she was had help and was not drinking, et cetera. And when we put that story out, the reporting was we were softening her image because of a story that the New York Times had written 3 months before that said she had a temper. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but it shows the complexity of running for office, especially as a woman, and shows the complexity of running for office as a woman in New York City.
And I would just add, a strategy of talking about the fact that you're a bulimic and an alcoholic as a way of softening your image is a bit silly, but nonetheless, that's how it got interpreted.
2 more questions. Yep.
Hi, thank you all for being here. My name is Lizzie, and I'm a Master of Public Policy student at the Kennedy School. Up until recently, and for most of the campaign, I think, I was living in New York City, and many of the events that I attended, particularly events for the LGBT community, people would introduce Christine Quinn as our next mayor, Christine Quinn, and I think there was a lot of confidence, especially in the LGBT community, that was outwardly portrayed, and I'm wondering how you feel about whether that might have helped or hurt the campaign.
We didn't show this clip, but look, there are certainly segments of any voting populace that there are religious sects, there are sort of oftentimes seniors who that's a disqualifying factor for them. Do I think it was do I think it overwhelmed? In this race, if identity politics were pervasive, I think oftentimes her gender in this race became more of a factor than her sexuality. That being said, there are certainly populations that it just is a non-starter for.
And I think dramatically in the documentary, you see at a gay rights rally, people lauding her, saying she's our big dyke, the next mayor, and then the next scene you see these, Orthodox rabbis saying she's evil and she should never be elected. So I think that captured the dramatic differences. Why don't we go to the last question?
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Valentina Perez, and I'm a junior at the college. Going back to some of the things that you were commenting on about the way that women candidates are covered, to the journalists and reporters on the panel, why do you think that women candidates are still talked about a lot more in the ways that they dress, in the ways that in terms of their physical appearance, in terms of things like their laugh and their temper? Why do you think that this type of coverage, which, like you said, isn't often talked about in reference to male candidates, persists?
Nancy, what do you think?
That's a tough question. I mean, I think part of what they were saying is sometimes it's the coverage and sometimes it's the way that reporting is received by the public. So that's a hard question to answer. Do you guys have thoughts?
Zena?
I mean, I think it's something that everyone can do a better job in sort of being conscious of their biases, but I do think that, you know, we can ask ourselves all the time, like, why are we making this editorial decision? But I think in terms of, you know, how she was portrayed or how she was reported on, you know, I think she is a woman. She's a gay woman. She also was a speaker, and I heard a lot of people talking about issues and being very educated about the issues and voting for her or against her or for another candidate based on the issues. So I think it was part of a mix, but I don't think it was so, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't think it was like one of the top reasons people voted for or against her, or she was portrayed one reason or another based on that. I don't know. I think it was just more subtle. It's a good question. I don't think anyone knows the answer, but.
I think it goes, we've obviously thought a lot about this. It goes to the qualities. It's not so much the stories themselves, although there's some of that. It goes to the qualities that people look to in leaders, as a male leader and as a female leader. And what happens is when you have a temper, when you are the tough speaker of the city council, and she was the tough speaker of the city council, and if you know, crossed her, she was not going to look too kindly on it. The same way that Tip O'Neill wouldn't, that other strong leaders would not in a legislative body, because that's how you have to run a legislative body. But the qualities that people want in a woman leader are nurturing, are different words and different qualities. And so it becomes much harder to run as a woman leader unless you can lead with nurturing. As I said in that clip, like leading with tough is very hard. And I think you saw it with, I think you saw that with Hillary to some degree, that there was some of that.
And let me just say, let you in on some inside detail of something that is on the cutting room floor. It shows how we dealt with the gender issue in a complicated way. Brent put together a 1-minute trailer for people to see, to get them interested in seeing this documentary. He opened it with Christine Quinn being made up. And we all thought this was a great intimate moment that showed you right away that we got access. We're seeing behind the scenes. One of our bosses said, wait a minute, we are not going to put out as the first scene in our trailer to this documentary, we are not going to put out a woman candidate being made up. But then we said, and there were women who helped make that decision. Like, I didn't think twice about it. Zena you didn't think twice when we first saw it, I don't think. But then you think of, when we said, well, if it was a guy, if it's de Blasio being made up, we might have opened with that. But then we realized, well, maybe so. Maybe it takes on a different meaning if it's us and a woman candidate. I mean, I don't know the answer, but all these things are much more complicated than you think, for us, for them, for everyone, and how people interpret what she says or how we report it, or when we comment on what she's wearing. Do we do that with the male candidates? These are very interesting, complicated questions.
Yes. I don't want to leave because I feel like we've been talking a lot about this and it's an important topic. I don't want to leave folks with the impression that we believe that she lost because she was a woman or because she was gay, because I do not believe that's why she lost the race. It is a complex issue to deal with. It is a complicating factor, but that's not why the election turned out, in my opinion, the way it turned out the way it did.
30-second question for Brent. What scene was left out that you wish hadn't been cut out?
There was one of the strategy sessions before the third debate, probably, and it was Josh, Isay, was in the room. She was in the room. A few of her strategists and advisors, and this was when de Blasio was the clear front runner. And so it was more sort of a change of strategy. How do we attack? And how do we use the Times and other newspaper endorsements to our advantage? And there was a moment where you were sort of looking, or she was looking to the endorsement for talking points about what she should say in an instance if she's challenged about her vision for the city. And I thought that was an interesting moment. You had to be in the room for a while to really make it pay off, and so for certain reasons it didn't work in the piece, but I felt like it was a very interesting scene.
And Mike or Josh, 30 seconds or less, is there a scene you wish had been cut out of the documentary?
The very, very last scene when you go to the final shot of her sitting there. She's on the stage. You sort of pan out, and I look like I'm about to jump off a cliff. That would have been fine to take out.
And finally, guys, has Christine Quinn seen this documentary?
Not as of Thursday.
She has not. Yeah.
Will she ever?
I'm sure she will. I'm sure she will.
Did you tell her she should see it?
No.
If you were her, would you have seen it by now?
No.
I don't think so.
No.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be, no.
But don't you kind of want to know what everyone else is seeing?
She knows the last scene. She knows
She
how
lived
it
it.
turned out.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
you know, it's not the mystery.
I mean, not for nothing, but you don't need the New York Times to tell you what took place over the course of the last year. She lived it. So.
On that note, thank you, all of you, for being here. Thanks for coming.